Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Sex Ed Taught Me. This is your host, Natalie Walton. For this episode, we actually have on our only male guest for the season, which I think is kind of interesting. I'm really excited for y'all to meet him. I love Ian. We met in college. And for this episode, we talk about masculinity, expectations surrounding sex and relationships, how our experiences growing up differed. As always, I'm really excited to be able to share episodes with you and share these conversations, and I hope you all really enjoy. So without further ado, here is Ian.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ian Harper. I'm from a middle-class suburban city in Pennsylvania. I met Natalie here at the University of Delaware. We met through a mutual friend, and our friendship quickly blossomed, and she asked me to come on this podcast, and I jumped at the opportunity. I love coming on and talking to her and seeing her lovely face. So Here I am.
Oh my God, what a nice note to start on. Okay, so you kind of introduced a little bit about your hometown, but is there anything else that you feel is important? So like politically, socially, what kind of like size school did you go to?
Yeah, I went to I would say like a medium-sized school. The interesting part of where I'm from is like it's right by an inner city. So there's like a smaller, more tough area surrounded by like a middle-class suburban area. And then being in Pennsylvania, it's all cowtown around that. So like my county is actually one of the more like liberal counties in the state, but it is surrounded by a nice bit of farm and like conservative, more like working class. So it's a nice little melting pot we have where I'm from. So it's a pretty good mix.
And then, so what kind of political leanings, because you mentioned having kind of a mix of people, does it feel like politically you're all kind of on the same page, or is it like very clear kind of distinctions?
It feels like there's like a pretty good, like a good majority of people, it feels like is in like a mix between like slightly leaning left to slightly leaning right, and then there's like a harder right. But for the most part, I always felt like it was a pretty good mix in the middle, like independent towards a little left or a little right. But I always felt like it was in that majority was just the same in terms of just in the middle.
And then, do you know like what kind of sex ed program you had? So like when you're thinking about it, does it seem like it was like mostly abstinence? Was it only abstinence? Was it like actually pretty like comprehensive?
I think it was, I would call it comprehensive. I think definitely as like it progressed as we got older and like went into high school and learned more, it got more comprehensive and talked about abstinence, but obviously they were like, this is not the reality. So they were pretty all-encompassing in terms of that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting kind of turn, I think, because I think a lot of programs are more like, we know what the reality is, we just don't want to admit it, so we're going to focus on abstinence and then just kind of like, you know, not like not see.
Exactly. My health teacher, we have health in like 11th grade where I went to school in high school, and he's one of the most down-to-earth people I know to begin with, but he was really cool. Great teacher, and he really was just like understanding. It's like, hey, everyone goes through this, we all know what this is. I'm going to be very open with you and very honest, and I'm going to teach you like what I'm supposed to teach you, but I'm going to explain to you because I know what the reality is, and I'm going to try and help you the best I can. So I think that definitely helped, is I had a great teacher.
Yeah, no, I really love that. Do you feel like it was only that one teacher, or do you feel like there was kind of like a network of people you could go to?
I feel like there was a network of people I could go to. I didn't really talk to any of the other teachers about it. He was really enough, like he was just great. So I always reached out to him, but I don't think I heard anyone really complain about the health department at my high school. Everyone seemed to all be like, yeah, it's a pretty good system they have going there.
Oh, yeah, no, that seems really nice, honestly. Like it sounds very pleasant. I feel like there's kind of a mix of stories of people who got like, you know, really good kind of intensive sex ed, and then there's a lot of people who also got like like barely any sex ed. Like they have all these like, stories about the way that sex ed kind of like missed the mark or like told them
Oh
something that
no.
just like wasn't, yeah. So it's kind of fun hearing, it's a little bit of a relief, I guess, to hear that there are people who did get like genuinely
Actual
helpful
sex
sex
ed.
ed. Yeah.
Not like the big mouth, like you're like, well, I don't know what's going on here.
And then, so you mentioned having sex ed maybe like 11th grade. Did you have classes before that, or did you kind of just have like one sex ed class?
Um, we had classes before that. I don't remember if it was like actually sex ed in like elementary school, but I remember getting like, we would watch like the puberty video and like, this is like your body going through changes. And I remember distinctly in 6th or 7th grade, like talking about sex in class. So that was like the first time I really remember. But we would have health all 3 years of middle school. So I have it all through then. And then we would jump to 11th grade and then we would have like our like big sex ed class.
So you had like how was your sex ed structured? So was it like kind of like for me, it was part of a health class. So it was like a unit within a class, or did you have like a, formal kind of sex ed
No, we had like
experience?
it was very much like you said there. It was like incorporated in like a larger class. It was like a segment like we do male reproduction and female reproduction, and we talk about like sex and like STDs and stuff like that. So it was kind of like a part of a course rather than a course itself. But it
Mhm.
did, I remember, take up a majority of the year of our health class, like a majority of the content.
Wow, that is so interesting because it's like I feel like for me it was like the exact opposite of like, okay, like how much can we share and how little time? Like what's like the most important? Let's just strip it down to like,
Yeah,
the
let's just
top 10 pieces of information.
yes.
Like,
Like this is what you need to know.
and then so you mentioned kind of having like your, puberty videos and stuff like that. What was that kind of the first experience for you, kind of realizing that like this is something that like people did? Like, is this something where
I
you're like, wow, okay.
I remember being, I don't think it was. I remember being very young. Like I remember being like 1st or 2nd grade, and I would always on the weekends they would play these terribly cheesy movies on the Sci-Fi Channel, and I remember I was like so enthralled by them. I was like, this is so cool. And they'd always have these scenes, but it was made for television, so like they would start like kissing and like doing all this, and then they would like cut to commercial, and then it would be like the after and like them getting dressed. And I remember being like, what are they? What could they be doing? And I remember like being like so confused, like what could possibly be going on? And then I remember in like it might have been like 3rd grade, my friend told me he was way more mature than I was. His mom knew it. She gave him a lot of information. So he told me, and I was like, that's kind of weird. So I don't know if like I ever like really clicked, but I do remember being in like like early elementary school and being like, okay, something's going on here.
No, that I feel like that makes sense. That checks out. I feel
Yeah.
like, yeah, like I definitely relate to the idea of like media being kind of a huge like factor, I guess, and like
Yeah.
learning and kind of just like like seeing things and being like, wait, like what's going on here? Like this seems because like I remember watching like I always talk about Pirates of the Caribbean because that was like a huge like seeing Keira Knightley, and that was like a huge moment for me personally growing up.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I always think about that movie and just kind of the weird like there wasn't anything like super explicit in the film. Like it was still very much like a Disney film and very much a family film, but like it definitely was kind of this like insinuated like
Yeah. I
you know what
agree.
I mean? And it was
Yeah.
definitely
I think like I would feel like tension. Like I could sense there is tension between characters, and it's probably the point. Like they're trying to be like, oh, there's a romantic interest between these two people. Like there's an attraction. I remember being like, this is like, it can't just be this. Like I remember watching like they would like kiss or like make. I remember being like, this is like the jump from that to them getting like changed was so like dramatic to me. I was like, what? Like what is happening? Like
that is
what
such
could be going on?
such an interesting memory to have. That's like
I don't know why, and it was probably my fault because I would force myself to watch those terrible sci-fi movies because they would have like animals in them. So I was like, oh, this is perfect. It's just what I'm looking for.
so actually relatedly, what other like ways did you learn about sex growing up? So like I know for me like music videos and like books were a huge part of growing up, but like did you have any other like outside of classes and, and sci-fi movies? Was there something where like, that really helped you?
I do. I think books was one. I mean, music obviously too. Like music is very suggestive. A lot of like increasingly as I got older and like listened to different music, it was very like suggestive. But I remember books, and I remember I would always like read these older books for my like age, and I would read like murder mystery or like
Yeah.
kind of like fantasy. And I remember being like, whoa, like this is not what I expected. And I remember being like, I remember asking my mom, like, am I allowed to read this? Like, is this okay? And she was like, yeah, like, sure, like, whatever. And I was like, oh, okay. And I remember just being like, this is, wow. Wow. Like, that was like my big takeaway, like, whoa.
I
And
know,
it's so
yeah.
funny to look back on. It's just like, it's nostalgic and it's just like so like a little bit awkward. It's like, ooh, like, am I supposed to be reading this? Was this intentional?
No, I definitely get that because I remember having a couple of books where even if I didn't necessarily like realize what I was getting myself into, like it was one of those where I'd pick books out and be like, oh, this is going to have something like in it. Like it was just
Yeah.
like I'd be reading a book and all of a sudden something would be mentioned and I'd be like, wait, what?
Was that
Like
like a mistype?
yeah, it's like, wait, what's going on here? Like what's happening? Because I remember it felt like such a dramatic jump from going from like books and media that was mostly about like dating and like wanting a boyfriend and stuff like that. Like I
Hmm.
remember all of those very distinctly, and that was like a huge theme and like still is a huge theme and like, YA and just kind of
Yeah,
like
definitely.
I don't want to say not even like children's movies, just like preteen movies. Cause like even on like Disney and stuff like that, people are like dating, Nickelodeon people are dating. So it's like I'd see it and I know that part, but then it was like all of a sudden it shifted. And I was
Yeah, it's
like,
no longer like a love interest and it's like a sexual partner. That was, I do
yeah.
remember like the dramatic jump, and I was like, whoa. Because I like you put it very like, that's how I was. Like, I wouldn't go into like a book or a movie being like, oh my God, I'm going to get to see sex or like read about sex. It was always like, this is something that interests me. And then it was thrown in like as a storyline or like a plot point or like to
Mhm.
develop a character. And I was like, oh, this is different than what I'm used to, especially coming from reading plenty of young adult and different novels growing up. I was like, whoa, this is very different.
It's like, okay, this is a shift. Yeah, it's like it's funny because I don't really remember like what happened in between. Like I don't know what it was for me. Like I don't have one singular thing where I'm like, yeah, that was the big moment. Like that's what like taught me. I understood everything at that point. Like that opened doors for me. It's like I just know that at some point there was like a sudden shift and I just had to kind of like deal with that. And at one point it went from, oh, I'm reading like, just nice little books about somebody who like wants to have her first kiss. All of a sudden it's like, teenagers
Yes.
having like casual sex. And I'm like, what happened? Like, I do think,
What happened to the kiss? What?
and I do think, cause I started watching like, Gossip Girl and stuff like that at a certain point. And I was like, I think that was like a big kind of like shifting factor of like, okay, like, and like the show wasn't even that like explicit. Like it's, CW TV 14, whatever.
Yeah.
But I was just kind of like, oh,
Yeah.
like is this like the routine, like okay, they're in high school.
This is what they do now. I do. It's funny you say that. I remember, I don't know which high school movie it was, but it's like quote unquote like a coming of age movie. And I remember like thinking like as a kid, like, oh, like you're like you want to have a girlfriend and you want to be cute and like do this stuff. And then it very like suddenly shift to like, oh, you want to be a womanizer and you want to have a lot of girlfriends and all this. And I was like, well, hold on a second here. I wasn't even prepared for the first part. I was still working on that. And it's like all of a sudden here are these different movies portraying guys this way. And I was like, whoa, this is very different.
No, that's actually a really interesting point because this conversation like just made me remember growing up watching MTV. I started watching MTV probably like way younger than I should have, and this was when it started really moving into like scripted. It's funny because I actually think we probably became teenagers when MTV suddenly started moving away from just being like reality television, because they
Yeah.
mostly did like Real World and Jersey Shore and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden they were like, here's like 4 different teen shows and, you know, have a good time. And they were all super like, you know, sexual in nature, definitely meant for like older teens, but like I'd still watch them because it was like, oh, this is like fun. Like I remember watching the show Awkward, which was like hugely developmental for me. Like that was one of those movies that I think was like, because it was the first time I think I saw like female sexuality, and it was like an exploration of female sexuality from this perspective of like, you know, someone who does like has no idea what's going on, like doesn't know what's happening. And it's like, I don't know if the show still holds up, but I remember watching it at that point and being kind of like, whoa, this is like a whole new door. Same thing with watching like the movie Easy A and stuff like that. Where it's just like, wow, this like this is totally new. And there was one show that I never ended up watching. I wish I could remember the name, and this is going to be such a vague reference because I never ended up watching it, but the trailers themselves were so crude. Like it was like this show about maybe like a teenage boy. It would have been MTV, probably like 2013 or 14.
Okay.
And I think he was just trying to like, you know, it was the same kind of late night comedy thing of like just a teen boy trying to like lose his virginity. Like that's the whole premise of it. And I'm like, I just remember seeing the trailers for those and being like, oh my God, like what is going on? Like what, like what? Oh my God.
I remember Easy A for like, that was something that like, it was like, just like you said, I was like, oh my God, like how do I lose my virginity and all that? And I remember being like so focused on that and like myself and like, well, what am I doing? Like all this. And then like female sexuality, it's an interesting thing you point out. Like, I feel like talking to like my friends and growing up, like that was something we never even thought of. It was like, you're so caught up in like yourself, like what's going on with me. And I remember I asked my sister that. I was like, do you ever think about like what's going on with like in guys? And she's like, no. She was like, I was so terrified that everyone knew that either I had a crush on them and all that, or like all this. I feel like it's such like it's so insecure, and like especially at that age, you're so like still trying to find yourself and like what you like or what you're interested in, and like just reaching out to like other people feels so foreign because you feel so alone and you're not. That is such like an interesting thing in my head.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point because it's like, you know, and especially coming from the perspective of me growing up where like I did not understand what everyone was talking about when they were talking about men. Like I just did not get it. I was like, yeah, I guess he's cute. Like, you know, so it's like really isolating for me kind of growing up and being like, okay, everyone else feels really passionately about this. Like everyone else is like talking about boys and like kind of figuring themselves out and whatever. And I was just like, I don't get it. Like, I just like,
it's just not for me.
Yeah. And it just, but it was like, I wasn't going to say that to anybody. And I didn't want to be like, you know, do you guys actually like these guys? Like, you know, there's
Are
no
you
way.
interested in him?
Yeah. It's like, there's no way of actually asking and being like, hey, so like, what's the vibe here? Like, what's going on? Like, do you guys, like, you guys actually have crushes? Like,
do you mean that? Is that true? Is that sincere?
So it's just, I don't know. I definitely agree on like the whole, like feeling isolated and kind of feeling like you don't really talk about it, or like when you do talk about it, it's definitely in like certain terms. I feel like it's kind of almost like you keep part of yourself to yourself because you don't want to say anything that would be like embarrassing or weird or you know.
I remember like vividly, I don't remember like who it was or even like why, but I remember having like crushes on people, and I remember being so afraid to even talk about it because I felt like either like ridicule or like, oh my God, you feel like you actually like someone. I remember being like young, like middle school, and being like, oh my God, I like girls. Is that okay? Like I remember being so nervous, like, oh my God.
Sweet boy. It's really interesting hearing that too, because I've always kind of wondered, I feel like, I don't know, at least maybe for me, I feel like men growing up were always, or I guess honestly boys, because of the age that we were, it was like, they were always the first ones to kind of bring it up and be the first people to like make jokes. Like it was always kind of like, you know, they would make all these crude jokes or be the first ones who kind of like, I don't even know how to phrase it. Like it's like they wouldn't necessarily talk about romance. Like it was almost like the girls were taught from a very, very, very young age kind of to look for romance and to seek romance and things like that. And then it was like somewhere along the way, guys were kind of like, you know, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be part of that, but also like let's skip to like the sex
jokes
stuff.
are funny.
Yeah,
it's funny. And I think you're right. And it could be like, I don't know why. Like, I don't know like the psychology behind it, but I remember it was like, it's something awkward and it's something like, again, like you said, like it feels like almost a little weird talking about. So it was a way to like almost humanize it. Like I remember like making jokes about sex made it feel less scary to me. Like that was like, I remember like a joke could be like, oh, it's just a joke. Like it doesn't feel anything crazy like that. And then like the romance was like, okay, it's like accepted. That's what I would do if I wanted to get a girlfriend. Like that's how you get a girlfriend. That's how I always thought about it. But to like normalize sex, I always thought jokes, but I do that with everything. So,
I mean, do you feel like that's how it was for other people too? Like, did you kind of get that energy that there are people who are like scared? Because I feel like one of the narratives we're kind of taught is that it's like, men from a very young age are kind of taught to just go for it. And like, you're not allowed to be scared. Like you're supposed to
I
be the
agree.
initiator.
I do think that because I remember being like, oh my God, like how am I going to get a girl to kiss me? Like, I don't feel like I'm that confident to go do that. And I feel like it was people no one would ever say they're scared. Like no guy was secure enough in middle school to be like, oh, I'm confident to go after, like, I'm not scared. But I think it was a way to like make it seem like almost, oh yeah, this is something everyone goes through. Like I remember I would go to sleep, like we'd have sleepovers with like my friends from the basketball team. And we would talk about how if you woke up with like an erection in the morning and we'd be like, oh my God, you do that too? Like that is like something that it just felt like it like normalizes everything to you. It's like, okay, I'm not crazy. It's not that scary. It happens. And then jokes were a way to just kind of relieve that tension and then maybe not be scared. I know I was scared. I don't know about anyone else.
No, that's really, I mean, it's kind of nice, I think, being able to have these conversations in retrospect and kind of looking back on it, because I do think middle school felt really kind of overwhelming in weird ways. Like there were certain things where it was like we kept pushing ourselves to keep up with like what we thought we were supposed to be, if that makes sense. Like it was a constant pressure of like, okay, I know all of the media I'm consuming is showing these things happening in like high school, but I feel like I need to be on it now. Like I need to have like, a boyfriend, I need to start moving, it's things like that. So I don't know, it's like nice, and it's it's good you can be like vulnerable about it too. And I really appreciate you sharing stuff like that, because it's really important, I think, to hear, and also just to, I don't know, like just to normalize it for anybody who might be, like listening.
Yeah,
or if there's any,
I feel like it is so scary. Like I remember like being vulnerable was such like a scary proposition, and like just talking about it uh, helped me. I know I would talk about it like even now as like a college student, I would talk about it with my roommates, like stuff we like happened with middle school, and be like, oh my God, like something so similar happened. And it'd be like, okay, so like you're not crazy, like this is just what happens. But the way you said like keeping up, I remember very much trying to be like, well, how do like I stay like up with the curve? Like what is everyone else doing? I was so worried about like, oh my God, he has a girlfriend, like I need to get a girlfriend. Like if he has one, I have to have one, like that type of stuff.
yeah, no, I definitely get that too. And it's interesting because we had kind of like, I don't know, the same idea of like keeping up, but it felt totally different, like in the ways that we went through it, that kind of idea. Like it feels like everybody was keeping up, but it was like in different ways. Cause for me, it was keeping up kind of like, not like a facade, but it was like trying to figure out what was missing. Like it was this idea of like, I didn't fully understand what was going on. And like, I don't always like phrasing it as like I always tell myself I was closeted, because I was deeply closeted for, the entirety of growing up. But like,
Yeah.
It's weird to call it that, because I didn't feel closeted at the time. Like it wasn't something where I was like aware of what was going on. It's kind of like a nuanced, like growing up, like I felt weird, and like I felt different, and it felt like I had to keep kind of forcing myself to fit in, because there was nobody who was having these conversations, and nobody who was sitting around and being like, hey, if like the reason why you're probably not actually that interested in getting a boyfriend is probably a little bit more complicated than just you don't like the guys at your school, that kind of idea.
It's probably something a little bit more than just that. It's funny you say that, because I remember I got like a book from my parents, and obviously I'm a straight man, so I can't relate to you more than like, obviously you went through different experiences, but I had a book and it would say like, I remember section was like, well, what if I'm attracted to boys? Like, what if I'm not attracted to girls? And it was like, it could be a phase, like all this. And I remember being like, well, that just it didn't sit right with me then. And it still to this day doesn't sit right with me now. Cause I had one of my best friends, he has two moms. And I remember asking my dad and being like, where's his dad? And he's like, well, he doesn't have a dad. And that was just enough for me. Like, I didn't need to know at that age, like, that people were gay or people were lesbians. And like, that didn't matter. But I remember getting to like 11th grade and we were talking about it and like reproduction. And my teacher, as I said before, great guy, he was like, you don't have to follow this. Like, if you're not into this, if you're not like a heterosexual person, this is not the right way to do it. They make it seem like it in school, like they only talk about that. But there's so many other ways, and there's so many other ways to express yourself and sexuality. He's like, don't feel boxed in because you don't hear people talk about it. It's there, it's normal, you're not crazy. Don't feel boxed in. And I remember that phrase, and I was like, wow, that's a really interesting thought, but obviously I'm part of that box. So
No, I love that, because I feel like I never really got that talk when I was growing up. Like, and
yeah.
what's funny is like, I don't know if you had the same experience or not, but growing up for me, it wasn't anything like an inherent effort of trying to like keep people in the closet, you know, that kind of idea. Like, at least in my experience, like I cannot speak for anybody else who grew up around me or anything like that. But like in my experience, it wasn't, you know, like I didn't have family who was going to be like necessarily upset with me. Like there were all these different factors, but it's nobody ever like, I think, thought to say that out loud and actually say like, you know, this is an important piece of the conversation, is just having somebody like an adult that you trust and somebody to go to who says you are not weird. Like everything that you're doing is totally normal. Yeah.
I remember my parents sat me down and were like, hey, like, we just want you to know, like, we love you regardless. Like, you just have to be open with us. And I was like, okay. And like, I remember like now it seems so like, at the time, it seemed so blasé, like, oh, of course they love me. Like, why are they saying this? But I guess, like, looking back in retrospect, it was basically them saying, like, we're comfortable with you if you're going to be gay, or if you are gay, like, and want to come out. And I remember, like, looking at that now, and, like, some of my family is, like, bisexual and gay. And it just feels like warms my heart to know that, like, from a family that was raised Catholic, that they were able to, like, feel comfortable enough to express that and wanted us to express it back to them. So that really makes me smile.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually it's interesting that you mentioned your faith kind of in connection with this. How do you think your like family's faith, like, I don't know how necessarily religious you are, but do you think it had an effect on like your understanding of sexuality growing up, or like your conversations about sex?
I think it did to a degree. I remember going to like CCD and like hearing about like abstinence and don't have sex, like all this. And I remember people who went to the Catholic school telling us about like what they would have, and like how like they'd have these really like almost strict like discussions about like not having sex. My family was always like loose. We always say we're faithful. We're like spiritual. We don't really follow it by that degree. But I remember being taught like from my parents that like sex was a thing about love. Like, it's an act of love. Like, don't, like, you're not just going to go out and, like, have, like, sex with anybody. So, like, I remember that was always, like, what I got the most from our talks with, like, our family about sex was, like, this is a loving thing. Like, you want to do this from a place of love. So I feel like that was kind of influenced by our faith. Like, you don't want to just go out and have sex. But my parents had the wherewithal to realize that might not be the reality. So they tried to code it in that. And so that was kind of like that little way that the faith influenced my education from my parents, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really nice. And it just seems really kind of like pleasant. And I mean, it's interesting too that you bring up love in particular, because I feel like a lot of people end up getting conversation or like getting told like to fear what they're going into, like to fear sex and to like fear sexual desire and stuff like that. I mean, do you feel like you got any of that from anybody growing up, or because it sounds like a lot of your stories have kind of a positive spin on them?
If I did, I didn't like really like focus or harp on them. I remember maybe like it felt taboo almost more than anything. It felt like a little like it didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable talking about sex all the time. It took a while for me to like come out and start talking about it, but I never felt like my desire or my interest in anyone was like bad, or like I never took that up. I remember like I said, like I would have like these Sunday school classes and they would like mention stuff. And I would be like in like sixth grade and be like, well, that's a weird comment. Or like, that's weird that they would say that. But like, I never got anything like malicious or like scary out of it. I never
Yeah.
felt that way.
No, that's a really it's just like nice to hear that. Like I know we've said this already, but it's like nice to hear that there's like positive experiences that
Yes.
have come
Yeah, I
out of
agree.
it. And especially in the sense of like, you know, because it sounds like maybe you had like maybe it was your family unit or just like the people that you were around or your friends or whoever it was, but you had people who like could overpower kind of any sort of like scare tactics. Because I feel like for me growing up, the stuff that resonated the most was kind of the scary parts, and I think that's just who I am as a person. Like that was just like I can be scared out of things if I'm told, like it's, you know, anxiety,
Yeah.
but like
No, it definitely is a factor.
but I feel like for you, maybe you had people who could kind of like outweigh that. And instead of it turning into a scary thing, you had the mentality of like, well, it's not really scary. Like it's, you know, what they're telling me right now. It's, I have, you know.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, it's a good way to put it. Like I always felt like I tried to, like, obviously, like there's pressures from other influences, like media, like we talked about. But I remember like coming from my family, it was like, well, this is something that like is gonna happen. And as long as you have like good intentions with it, like it's not going, nothing really bad can come from it. That's from what I remember thinking. Like, all right, like I remember I'd be nervous and I'd be like, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, and then I'd be like, well, okay, well I can look back and be like, all right, well it's if it's gonna happen, as long as I can control something, I can make it like a positive, and that's how I looked at it.
Oh, that's so nice. It's just, and then when you're thinking about kind of everything collectively, so like everything that you learned, all of the stuff that you were told, how do you think all of this has affected you as a person? Like, has it, or do you just feel like you barely even register that you went through sex ed, that kind of idea?
Um, I honestly don't. It doesn't feel like it resonates much with me unless I start talking about it. Like, for example, like right now, like I have not even thought about like that, but I subliminally feel that way. Like, okay, like as long as you have like the right intentions and all that, it'll come into play. I remember the other one though in like high school was it was always the like social media and like the portrayals of sex for like teenagers. And I remember being like, oh my God, like there's a pressure. Like there's like, okay, you have to go have sex. Like you have to go do this. And I remember that. And then it was like, I finally, once I had sex, I was like, okay, that was it. Like that, the pressure's gone now. Like, so, I mean, it just felt like, okay, like I could just, and I just went back and like looked at like what I'd learned and like what people had taught me that were close to me. And I think that subliminally it does, but I don't really, it doesn't register on a daily basis. Like I had sex ed and like that stuff and like a health class that helped me. But yes, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess kind of related to all of this too, when you were, so kind of going back a little bit, when you were talking about different ways that you learned about sex, there's, I ask these questions because I grew up as like a cis woman. Like I had male friends, but obviously there were things that I would not hear. Like I was not there for those
Yes.
conversations. And you mentioned, you know, kind of like sleepovers and like, you know, conversations you'd have. I mean, how do you think you're like growing up? I mean, just being like a, you know, a guy and having, you know, male friends, like what was that for you? Like, did you learn anything from them? Did you like exchange like, you know,
We it got
information?
it got better as it got older. Like I still like I would talk to my roommates in college and be like, well, what worked for you and like stuff like that. But I remember in like middle school and high school being like, oh my God, I would feel light years behind. Like I was like, oh my God, I only just had like a kiss, or like, oh my God, we just held hands. And like they would say this stuff. And I remember being like, I felt pressure, like I said earlier. But I also felt like it made it seem like it was kind of contradictory to what my parents had taught me, which is like, this is supposed to be like an act of love. Like you go have sex because you love somebody. It's like a showing of your affection and all that. And it seemed like when I would talk about it with like guys that age, it seemed like it was like almost just like another like marker, like, oh, I had sex, or like I've had sex like multiple times. It was like, oh, okay, like what what does that mean? And like they were like, oh well, like I remember the phrase like you're not a man until we've had sex, like, and like the insult of like you're a virgin. And I remember being like, oh my God, like I have to have sex, like, so they can't call me a virgin. So I can't have that insult thrown at me. I felt like that was like a big thing. But like once I got to college, it felt like much healthier. It was like, oh, okay, like, are you like interested? And like we would talk about like different things we've tried. And it was very much more open and like a dialogue rather than like almost, I felt like I was getting lectured at in high school by other guys.
No, and that is such an interesting point to bring up and make, because it's like, I feel like it really shows how high school can be and how much pressure there is to conform, even if you don't necessarily want to, or like, you know, even if you have other influences, like, you know, for example, your parents who are kind of like, hey, this is, you know, a way of approaching it. And that seemed to resonate more with you, but you still felt the pressure when you were like in this environment. And I think that's definitely something a lot of people go through and can connect with. Like, I think there's just whatever kind of experience it was, like whatever it was that they felt they needed to like catch up with, or whatever they needed to like pretend or, you know, do or lie about or say about themselves, you know, it's they still felt like they needed to for one reason or another.
Yeah, I agree. And I think conformity, like I never even thought of it that way. It's definitely a form of conformity. Like just like, oh, give in. Like I remember sitting in like the lunchroom and being like with my buddy and being like, I don't want a girlfriend. Do you want a girlfriend? He's like, no, like I'm not interested in like any of the, like, I don't want a girlfriend right now. And I remember being like, why did everyone keep telling us like about this? Or like, you have to go find a girlfriend. Like, it seemed like everyone was so stressed about dating and having sex. And it just felt like, I guess, wrong at that time for me. So it was just, it's an interesting way to look at it that I never really thought of before, of conformity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so when you're thinking about everything that you've learned, how comprehensive do you think your understanding of kind of sex and sexuality in general was when you were growing up? So it seems like you had some like good talks and lessons, and you had kind of a number of sources that were contributing. But I mean, do you feel like you learned everything that was necessary as an adult, or is it like you like, you know, still felt like there were things missing?
I guess I always was like, I felt like there was stuff missing, but I feel it's like stuff you weren't gonna learn until like you had a sexual partner and you started talking to someone. I feel like I was going to know as much as I was going to know going into it without having actually talked to someone in the act of having sex with them. So I think I had a pretty comprehensive approach. And then once, like, I think communication in sex is like such a huge thing. And then once you like, I feel like that's the one thing actually that might be missing is like, you have to talk to your partner. Like, what do you enjoy? Like, does this feel good? Like, what should we do here? I feel like that is such like one thing that I would want someone to know is like, you have to talk to the other person. And it feels so weird and like obvious to say, but I feel like it's not that well known. So like, that was like the one thing, like once I like got there and started having like partners and I would talk to them, that was something that I was like, okay, I had everything I needed to know.
No, I think that's a really great point, because like, I know for me going through sex ed, I was not told anything really about like communication or like having a healthy partnership in general. Like, it was just kind of not something we really talked about. It was more just like, be nice and, you know, date someone who you really like and things like that. But it was never a conversation about like, oh, you should actually talk about these things, and like it's okay to sit down, and it's not weird, and in fact it's really beneficial when, you know, partners sit down and are like, okay, here's realistic outcome, like this is what I'm looking for, this is what I expect, this is, you know, what we can do, that kind of idea. It's definitely I think those aspects really do kind of get lost. It's the same thing, like, you know, we don't really, like, I don't know about you, but like I never got any sort of talk about like consent or anything where it was like actually like like, I guess thinking about it in terms of like sex with another person, like it was kind of like we were taught to just like think about ourselves in the context of
I think that's like a good way to put it is like, you're always taught about yourself, like what you're going to like go through, like the experience. But I do remember like in high school, like that was one thing that was lacking. Like they never talk about consent. And it was like, almost they expected these like 16 and 18, like to 18-year-olds to just understand consent and like be able to like provide it. And then you go like, obviously we had the same intro from Delaware, but it was like consent was so hammered. And I remember like reading it and being like, why is this not more like known. Like, why don't people tell you this? Like, I felt like that, like something like that was taught, I guess for me by, again, my parents. My parents were like, this is like, you want to like obviously make sure the person's okay, like you want to talk to them. But I just remember thinking like, this is something that feels like so necessary, and it's something that's really not taught as universally, maybe definitely as it should be. Like the fact that a university had to teach me this so I could come in and being a functioning member of their school is ridiculous that I wouldn't have already known that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I really do think this is one of those things that should be taught before people are having sex. Like I think people assume sex ed only needs to start around the age that people are actually starting to have sex, or even just like have partners in general, like people that they're interested in or trying to date. And it's like usually by the time they're already doing it, you've missed the boat on at least a couple. Like it's, you know,
I agree.
yeah, it's like I can't remember off the top of my head what statistics look like, and statistics are going to vary from, you know, state to state and county to county and things like that. But it's, you know, there are kids who start having sex pretty young, and it's like if you start going off of these like, you know, middle averages, like if you don't teach sex ed until 16, it's like there are people who've already tried it, are already thinking about trying it, already have their own kind of ideas in mind. So it's like if you start talking to them earlier and start teaching them, because it's like consent too is such a like human thing, like the idea of like respecting a partner, respecting other people, like having conversations is so like human and so necessary. It's like, why wouldn't we teach that to begin with? Like
exactly. It's so funny. Like I talked to my sisters about it, and like I would talk like about like, what if they dated someone and like they're like, well, what if like this, and it's like they would start explaining this stuff, and consent like obviously comes up, and it's like, well, that's not them being a good person, and that's being just decent. Like you would expect that. Like I don't feel like that's something that should be sought as like someone's doing a good thing. Like that's something doing the right thing. That's like the easy thing. You need to do that. That's always how I looked at it.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really like important way of looking at it too, and an important way of teaching people is just being like, you don't do it like to be a good person. Like you don't do it to get like the star. It's you do it because you have to, like because you should, and because it's an obligation.
Like it's the decent thing to do. Just do it.
Yeah, exactly. And then, okay, so how has your understanding of sex changed over time? So like when you're thinking about, because you've kind of described all of these different factors, like it all comes together as kind of like a story and like a narrative arc, but how do you think as a person, your understanding of sex has changed from like, you know, your very first lesson on puberty to now? Like, has it really, or has it always kind of been the same idea?
It's evolved. I think it's always like, it's kind of like a growing like understanding. When I first learned about it, it felt like, it felt like almost how I was taught about it. Like that's how it would change in my understanding. Like you view it and it's like, okay, this is essential for life. Like this is how people are born. Like this is how we recreate. And then like my parents' influence, and it's like, okay, but you do it out of love. It's like a loving act. And then as like media gains, it's like, okay, but like this could be like a thing, like looking at like 50 Shades of Grey, it's like a power thing. Like you can look at it from like a lot of comprehensive ways. And it just comes down to like, it's so funny to say, sex is complicated. Like I feel like sex is whatever you make it to be. Like you could be doing it as a loving act with someone. It could be like a release, or like in terms of like casual sex, like you're just looking for like an escape. So that's really how I look at it. I just look at it as like an act that you get out from whatever you want. Like you can get out of it whatever you please. That's how I look at sex.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting way. I keep saying it, but I feel like it is, because it's like, I don't know even if I've ever really thought about it that way, because it's, I don't know, it's just, yeah, it really is something that's so individual. And so like, because I'm like trying to like think through it and trying to like come up with something coherent.
I want you to know, this is what I've thought about at work for like the past like week since I've received like what this is gonna be. I was like, well, what does it mean to me? Like really, like I'm like helping like clean tiger enclosure. I'm like, but what does that mean to me? And that's really what it came down to. I was like, well, it changes. It's like, well, if I'm looking at this person and it's like, okay, quickly, like a one night stand. It's like, okay, well, that's different than like if I'm dating someone and we're having sex. It just always, it felt so different for the scenario and the situation. So that's how I kind of approached it and look at it as a
Yeah.
whole.
No, I really, really like that because it's true, because it's up to kind of you as an individual, what you want to get out of it, what you're kind of like expecting of yourself. And like, there's reasons why people, for example, go on Tinder versus ask like mutual friends for recommendations on like, well, not recommendations, but like ask them for like,
Like,
like to be like matched
meet
up with
new
some
people.
yeah, exactly, like kind of that idea of like, you take on different methods to meet different people for different things. You're not necessarily going to go to a bar to meet like the love of your life. I mean, you might, but it's, most of the time that's not what people are doing.
Well, you say that, yeah, like that's why I always like talking to people about like how they met. If like in like couples, it's like, well, we met on Tinder. It's like, okay, that's an interesting like way to start. Like you met through that. Or there's people who like build connections as like friends first. And then they like, that always just seems so interesting to me that like we can all come to this same conclusion from so many different paths of like meeting and like why we met up in the first place.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
maybe it's again coming back to like how I look at sex, like, but with like love, but like it can like create love, or it could be like a showing of love. I always thought it can like strengthen. It's really an interesting concept. That's how I like looking at it.
No,
It's like
that's
a positive spin in my mind.
yeah, it's a really nice way because like this is coming from me who grew up basically being told like by my sex ed class that like, if you have enough partners, I keep using this story on the podcast, but like, you lose your capacity to love eventually. Like, it's just one of those things where like, you reach a certain number of people and they're like, sorry, like,
No more.
yeah, that's exactly what they were teaching us. And it was kind of this idea of like, yeah, like you could run out, like your love like meant the same thing to everybody, and it was, you eventually could like lose your capacity and you couldn't produce anymore after a certain point.
Wow.
So it's yeah, I know, imagine telling a bunch of like 14, 15-year-old kids that, but it's really nice having people kind of explore that more. And I think for all of us to kind of like get out of that point for, I think a good chunk of us kind of reach a point where we're like, no, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like,
yeah, it's not that simple. We can't just sum it up like that.
Yeah, because it's like it doesn't just like disappear, like it's you can, it depends on what you're looking for at that time, who your particular partner is or partners. It's there's a lot of different factors that come into play that will affect how you're viewing your relationship, how serious you want a relationship to be.
I agree.
Yeah.
And then especially like I look at it like there's so many different kinds of love. Like this is like getting really in depth with this like one word that again you can't sum up in like one like quick phrase, but like attraction is like a form of love. You could be attracted to someone and you like, oh, I want to have sex with that person. I'm attracted to them. Or like you said, it could be more intricate and more like intertwined and like you really care about this person. And then it's like the act of having sex is like a different form of showing of the same word, love. It's very interesting.
You're such a romantic, Ian. This is so nice. And then, so kind of like summing everything up, you already mentioned one point about what you wanted to see taught in the future, kind of about communication and talking to people. Is there anything else where like, if you could guarantee that like every kid learned it, you would make sure it was taught?
Okay, well, I promised you this story, so I'm going to kind of go on like a little silly route. It's more to like the boys. I think everyone should know what blue balls is, really, because I remember I got my book. It was my changing body and me, and I remember being in like 4th or 5th grade and reading about it, and I remember having like a pain in my testicles, like a very like it hurt so bad. And I remember being like, oh my God, what is wrong with me? So I went to my book and I opened it up and I was like, okay, like it's gotta be that. That is it to a T. So I called my dad in, who told me like, if there's anything you need to talk to me about, just come in. And my poor father, a father of 5, came in and heard his like 11-year-old son explain to him that he thought he had blue balls. And my poor father had to go, Ian, I promise you do not have blue balls. I promise you. So I was like, Dad, it's that to a T. He's like, I promise you it is not that. So that would be my main thing besides communication and consent being taught is teach the dear boys what blue balls is so they don't have that awkward interaction. Save a father and his son some dignity.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I don't think now that you've publicly embarrassed yourself.
My forefather was like, no, I promise you, I swear to you, this is not what this is.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, that builds character. That really, that strengthens a bond.
that'll do it. Yeah. Oh.
But all right, I am all set with questions for you. If you have any other stories you'd like to share, you absolutely have permission
No,
to.
I
I'd
think that's the creme de la creme of what I have. I think that's the best.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Hi everyone. Before we, tune out, I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of Sex Ed Taught Me. Thank you for supporting this podcast and supporting this kind of, ridiculous hodgepodge idea that I came up with, because I wanted to see it and try it out and see what happens. A huge thank you to Jake Miller, who is the editor and kind of just he mixes the podcast, he puts this all together for us. I honestly think he's the reason why you're even hearing it right now. So huge thank you to him, and huge thank you to our guests who are coming onto the show. If you are interested, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at SexEdTaughtMe, so hopefully it should be pretty easy to find. And if you want to send anything in to us, if you would like to be a guest, if you just have a funny story you'd like to share, if you have any questions or things you want to clarify, or whatever reason it might be, you can also email us at sexedtaughtme@gmail.com. But again, thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time.